Yeah, my interest in this has been quite long-standing. For since 2008, I've been running a salon and a kind of web group called Ecology, Cosmos and Consciousness, where we've had kind of somewhere in the region of about 100 guest speakers come and talk about the fusion of all these different topics, including anthropology, parapsychology, ecology, and so on, at the Institute of Ecotechnics in London, who were the organisation behind creating the Biosphere 2 project, which you may be aware of, a kind of an attempt to understand the complex interactions of various species in a closed environment for the purpose of terraforming Mars. In terms of the interest in psychedelics and ecology and what even ecopsychology, this seems to be fairly nascent. I would say like the origins of movements of ecology, even deep ecology, Arnie Ness, and even ecopsychology have been influenced, of course, by psychedelics, but there's been very little written on that in kind of direct relationship until Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, put out a special issue in about 2011, I think, on psychedelics and ecology. I followed that up in 2013 with an edited volume on ecopsychology and the psychedelic experience with the European Journal of Ecopsychology. But there hasn't been much research until about the last 5 years, which I'm going to come to. So one of the things we do at Greenwich is we put on a psychedelic research conference at the university where I work. We've been hosting that for about 10 years. And you can see this influx of interest in ecology and ecopsychology kind of moving into that realm. That's what our conference usually looks like. Sorry, here we go. So much so that we held a special symposium on psychedelics, eco-consciousness and ecological crisis last year. And I can point you to those resources if you'd like to investigate that further. So following on from Jack Hunter, I'm going to attempt to do some slightly more pixelated kind of Venn diagrams of interaction of different fields of research. In this case, I'm going to look at it from the perspective of psychology and ecology. And there is a kind of overlap between these two areas on the first hand, environmental psychology, which is really very much about how humans interact with their environment. So kind of with kind of traffic, with architecture, the built environment, and so on and so forth. But an offshoot is called ecopsychology, which is specifically kind of to do with the kind of mental health and well-being of individuals in relationship to their environment. And this was pretty much kind of started by Theodore Roszak, and he put out his book in the 1990s, The Voice of the Earth, and later an edited book called Ecopsychology. And the purpose of ecopsychology is essentially the idea that nature is therapy, that, you know, urbanization and our increasing divorce from nature is the source of a lot of our and he said that ecopsychology is directed at showing humans a way of healing the alienation caused by our detachment from nature. And its purpose was to build a sane society and a sustainable culture through the purpose of nature-based psychotherapy, shamanic counseling, and interspecies relationships. So you can see here this kind of fusion between psychology and ecology. Somewhere perhaps embedded within that, you might see the notion of shamanism. Now, shamanism itself, in the study of it, is a much bigger field, but where it intersects with psychology and ecology, you might find a natural home for it within ecopsychology. Shamanism itself is, you know, an archaic and ancient practice. It's thought to be the kind of religion, one of the earliest magico-spiritual practices based on the archaeology. We don't know for certain, but we do still find shamans in indigenous communities all over the world still practicing what we think they would have been doing a long time ago, which is kind of pagan animistic perspective to ontology and the nature of reality. And so shamans are people who go into altered states of consciousness at will to transcend time and space and bring back useful information. And that in itself is an aspect of psi, right? So because it involves things like psychic diagnosis, healing, psychopompic activity, communicating with spirits of the dead, communicating with the spirits of nature, divination, precognition, the location of lost objects, the location of game for hunting, the location of enemy tribes to go and fight, clairvoyance, etc. But they also go into these states to communicate with the spirits of nature. And Jeremy Narby suggests that it is a nature-based epistemology, and it's very much ecological to its core. To give you an example, I've been working with a Mexican indigenous tribe that make use of peyote cactus, which is this mescaline-containing psychedelic cactus. Now, archaeological evidence suggests the use of cactus in that region in a kind of within a shamanic context goes back at least 5,500 years. And it's thought, you know, that the Waradica tribe, better known as the Huicholes, have this kind of ancient lineage of use of psychedelic cactus, the peyote. But they have a very unique relationship with nature, and I think their use of the cat in their culture exemplifies the kind of worldview of indigenous, shamanic, animist, pagan cultures around the world. And so this is a quote from David Lawler. He says, ecologically, during the peyote hunt, I mean, they literally hunt it like they would hunt deer with bows and arrows, the Huicholes achieve a spiritual relation to their physical environment, not a neutral setting, not a mere place to live or exploit for a living. The very landscape is sanctified. The caves, the springs, the mountains, the rivers, cactus groves, and the features of the mythical world are elevated to cosmic significance. Plants and animals become only labels, conventions, mere human categories of thought. Distinctions between them are illusory. Man is nature. And I think that kind of worldview pervades most of the shamanic kind of thinking, certainly the ones I've encountered. Now, the roles of shamans are kind of multifarious, and you know, they don't necessarily all engage in all of these roles, but if you were to kind of develop a list, you might consider that shamans often take on the role as healers, mediators, seers, i.e. transcending time and space and going into the future to bring back useful information, psychopomps, communicating with spirits of the dead. But they're also tricksters, magicians, storytellers, poets, artists, musicians, dancers, and they are the spiritual gatekeepers for their tribe, for their community. But beyond that, they are also, and this is an important role, caretakers of nature. They mediate between the human and the non-human world, between human persons and non-human persons, to maintain a kind of an equilibrium and balance with nature through the activity of reciprocity, in that you always give as well as take in your relationship to nature, and therefore maintain a balance and harmony. And their kind of biggest role, which they do not take lightly, is that they are literally healers of the world. They believe that they maintain the spiritual harmony for the whole biosphere through their work. So we find shamanism perhaps located within this kind of eco-psychology, but probably more so within the realm of transpersonal studies, which kind of touches on both psychology, transpersonal psychology, and transpersonal ecology, but could be fused together in a kind of transpersonal eco-psychology. And of course, given that shamans go into altered states of consciousness at will, they tend to do so using a variety of techniques. Now, of course, dreaming is the most prolific variety, because almost everybody dreams, and so it's a kind of a bit of a freebie. But they also use the other Ds as well, such as drumming, very important to most shamanic traditions, but not all, dancing, diet, and of course what we call drugs, but what they call plant teachers or allies or medicines, right? So I'm going to focus on that in particular, and I think there's room here for a psychedelic transpersonal eco-psychology. And beyond that, honing in for this particular talk, I think, you know, we can consider parapsychology is to transpersonal, parapsychology is to transpersonal psychology what engineering is to physics in many respects. And it really is very much coming under this same umbrella of the psychology of exceptional human experience. So I think even perhaps if we kind of zoom in a bit further within that, we could have room for a psychedelic para-eco-psychology or a psychedelic eco-parapsychology, depending on which perspective you're coming from. Right, so even though this is a kind of a relatively new and made up neologistic new research area, there hasn't been much written on it, as you might expect. Myself and a student published an article recently in Transpersonal Psychology Review evaluating the role of mystical experiences in a transpersonal ecopsychology. So bringing in both the mystical and the exceptional experience and drawing upon the emerging literature that we have coming through this psychedelic research renaissance. After a kind of era of 50 years of prohibition, there's now this kind of explosion of interest in psychedelic research. So my own kind of research endeavors in this area go back about 15 years. When I first conducted a survey looking at the variety of transpersonal and parapsychological experiences that people have under the influence of psychedelics. So I conducted this, relatively modest-sized survey, about 150 respondents, and got them to report on the specific kinds of experiences they'd had with transpersonal nature under the influence of particular psychoactive drugs. And I broke this down into different categories. The ayahuasca group as a special subcategory, general psychedelic users and non-psychedelic drug users. So these are people making use of, heroin, cocaine, alcohol, crack, whatever it might be, prescription drugs, and so on and so forth. And we don't really see the occurrence of these transpersonal-like experiences under the use or under the influence of non-psychedelic drugs. And yet we do see a high prevalence of these experiences under the influence of psychedelic substances, plants, and drugs as well. So much so that, for instance, with ayahuasca, this experience of plant entity encounters or plant substancy encounters, so that whereby people feel they've come into communication with the very substance they've ingested, be it ayahuasca or magic mushrooms, is as high as 70% in our sample of ayahuasca users, and about 42% in other psychedelic users as well. Experiences of telepathy under the influence of psychedelics were also very prevalent. About half of all psychedelic users, 50%, 51%, reported experiences of telepathy under the influence of psychedelics. So these are very reliably induced, these extraordinary, exceptional, parapsychological, transpersonal experiences. I hope you can still hear me. My internet is a bit unstable, apparently. Right, so, and in terms of these experiences where people feel like they're in communication with other species, or in communication with the spirit of the plant or the plant itself or the fungus, this is nothing unusual to shamanic indigenous cultures. This is perhaps something unusual to this Western worldview, as Jack pointed out, this kind of Western self. But you can see here that people who use psychedelics will often have these kinds of experiences of a individuated kind of self. To give this quote here from Luis Eduardo Luna from our latest book, which is coming out soon, he said, "In mythical times, animals, plants, and humans were all persons, able to transform. They were all shamans. You find this idea in old narratives. In the beginning, everyone was a person. The original condition common to humans and animals is not animality, but rather humanity. Shamans are able to see non-human beings as they see themselves, as human. Those playing the role of acting interlocutors in specific dialogues." And he took that quote from Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, a Brazilian anthropologist. But he goes on, he says, "In Western science, it's all about being objective, taking away the subject so you have the full objectivity. In Amerindian shamanism seems to be guided by the reverse principle, the opposite idea. To know is to personify, to take the point of view of that which is to be known, or rather, who. For shamanic knowledge envisages something which is someone, another subject or agent. The other takes the form of a person." So I think that one of the basic ideas of shamanism is that in order to learn something, you become that what you want to learn from. So knowledge is becoming, transforming into. And I'll come back to this notion of even beyond communication, but also transformation in psychedelic experiences. So I wanted to follow up on my original 2005 survey, where a lot of people reported these extraordinary transpersonal and parapsychological experiences under the influence of psychedelics, and asked them how their experiences of a more eco-conscious nature occurred. So I asked people what kind of transpersonal nature encounter experiences occur and with which substances. But before I did that, I also surveyed people's changes in attitude and behavior of a more ecologically oriented variety, extending from their use of psychedelics. Because at this point in time, about 5 years ago, there was literally no data on this particular question. So I had about 150 people in this survey back in 2005 or so. And I asked people, how have your psychedelic experiences changed how much you interact with nature? So about 20% said they interacted about the same, but the majority of the remaining 80% said that they interacted much more with nature, having had a psychedelic experience because of their psychedelic experiences. So it enhances interactions with nature. The other thing I wanted to ask them was, so how does your sense of connection and concern for nature change from having had a psychedelic experience? And this is a brilliant finding in that it's very rare you put out a survey to over 100 people and 100% of them are in agreement with one of the questions. And that is, everybody who'd taken psychedelics in my survey said their sense of connection with nature had increased because of their psychedelic experiences. And about 2/3 of the sample also said their concern for nature had increased as well. Curiously, a small sample of about 15% said their concern for nature had actually decreased as a result of their psychedelic experience. And if we had more time, we'd go into the possible reasons for that, which we've looked into in further detail. But I also wanted to understand then, well, not only how attitudes are changed by people's psychedelic experiences, but how their behaviors are changed too. I'll come back to that in a second, because we're not expecting this slide. And I wanted to ask also which psychedelic substances had changed. And we found typically it was the organic, plant-based or fungus-based substances which had induced the most change when people volunteered a particular substance was responsible for their changing connection and concern. And top of the psychedelic pops, of course, was psilocybin mushrooms, aka magic mushrooms, psilocybin containing fungus. Right at the bottom, actually, we see synthetic substances, particularly, ketamine, which is a dissociative anesthetic and very much detaches you from your environment during the experience, actually reduce people's connection and concern for nature. But on the whole, most psychedelics enhanced it. And then looking, as I said, at changes in behavior, there's a whole raft of different behavioral changes which we see ensuing from people's psychedelic experience, so much so that more than half of our samples said they changed their diet as a result of taking psychedelics, be it going vegetarian, vegan, freegan, vegan, raw, local, whatever it was, I didn't actually check. But also we see changes of about half the sample, more than half the sample, saying that they'd increased gardening, right? So this is an extraordinary raft of drugs that we have here. You can see it splashed across the kind of newspaper headlines. Dangerous psychedelic drugs turn people into rampant gardeners, right? And the evidence is there. I mean, presumably, they're not just all growing magic mushrooms and cannabis, but they've actually taken a real interest in plants and nature in general. And we can see that because it's evident from their other behavioral changes, not least of which is the one I like the most, is that in my sample, 16% of people changed their career having taken psychedelics, okay? So that they took up careers that were more ecologically orientated. To give you two examples from my sample, they gave up the jobs they were doing and started out on a course to study PhDs in botany as a result of their psychedelic experiences. So we're seeing some really dramatic, life-changing, more ecologically oriented effects coming out of people's use of psychedelics. Now, bringing it back to the transpersonal realm of experiences, I was interested to know what kind of extraordinary experiences, perhaps of a shamanic-like nature, people were having under the influence of psychedelics, and in which particular psychedelics were the most likely to cause those experiences. So encounter experiences with, mythic beings, elementals, nature spirits, elves, encounters with hybrid, half human, half animal, tyranothropes, plant encounters, plant intelligence or communications with plants, encounters with spirits or communications, transformations into other species, which is a very common shamanic motif, as was discussed, and then also visions of a nature-oriented type. And here's the kind of breakdown of the results for different psychedelic agents. So, you could see here, perhaps let's take the example of psilocybin mushrooms, encounters with plant intelligences or communications. About 30% of people are taking mushrooms have had those experiences. Mythic encounters, about 20%. Ayahuasca is also another good example. Plant encounter experiences, about 37% of users, even down to transformation. So this is the experience of feeling like you've turned into another species. At 27%, over a quarter of all people who are taking ayahuasca, my sample, said they'd had one of these particular experiences. And it was my belief that these transpersonal experiences were likely to fuel these profound changes in people's ecological orientation, their kind of identity becoming more in the direction of the ecological self through these transpersonal experiences. Now, these experiences may sound pretty far out, perhaps not to this particular crowd, but if you think of this explosion in the psychedelic renaissance and people in their droves going out to South America to take ayahuasca for, spiritual growth or to kind of creative problem solving for their new tech app or whatever it might be. And then a quarter of them are coming back and saying, wow, to their friends, I just got turned into a plant or a tree or a jaguar. And I completely was convinced by that experience. This is something astonishing. And Andy Lecturer has spoken a lot about this experience as the animaphany, the encounter with the spirits of nature, with the other world of other species in a kind of metaphysical, mystical way. And, in a classic Foucauldian discourse analysis, this in the common Western worldview is considered psychotic, essentially. This is, you've gone mad if you have one of these experiences. But as myself and Stan Krippner said way back when, which is the more mad, communicating with the spirits of nature or sitting back while Earth's ecosystem descends rapidly into the greatest wave of mass extinction in 65 million years? And so we really are seeing these kind of experiences ensuing from people's psychedelic encounters of a shift, from this notion of self, as Jack pointed out, go-orientated, we're the top of the food chain, we are apart from nature, nature is there to be exploited and, colonized and extracted from for its resources, to this more kind of ecological self, right? Whereby humans and other species are all on a kind of parallel, and much in this kind of shamanic worldview. And I'll come back to more of that in a minute. Oh, here we are. They're already surprised by my own slides. So we did a follow-up survey as well, which we just completed this year. We presented at a conference earlier this year. And we had a bigger sample, about 300 people, and we included this different measure. And it's called the inclusion of nature in self. So you basically give people these kind of Venn diagrams of self and nature. And on one extreme, you have self and nature completely separated. On the other end of the scale, you have self and nature in a complete unity. And we got people to rate where they were on this scale of these different Venn diagrammatic overlaps. And we found that our group reported they scored somewhere quite high on the scale. These are the people who'd taken psychedelics, and somewhere on about 4.5, which also corresponds to some recent research, a prospective study of people going into a psilocybin retreat in Holland, and they found changes in people's inclusion of nature and self to the same extent we did. So ours was about in the region of about 4.5, somewhere between these two diagrams, which in itself is much greater than the general population and much greater than the original sample, which was used to validate this measure, which about a 1-point increase. And the original sample that was validated on were all environmentally kind of orientated individuals anyway. So we see this, that psychedelic users, certainly the ones in our samples and have been to psilocybin retreats, have this much greater sense of self and nature identity. And so in our second survey, we also looked at it more qualitatively. We drilled down into people's kind of verbal accounts of their experiences, and we kind of generated this kind of thematic map or kind of model. And we found that people fell into two basic categories. Now, we found that the transpersonal experience seemed to be key in pretty much all of people's kind of enhanced eco-consciousness from their use of psychedelics, which is as I previously suspected, but that it worked in two different ways. We found that about 2/3 of our group who reported a kind of transpersonal transformation in their eco-consciousness had already had a strong connection with nature in the past, but their psychedelic experience had actually amplified their connection. Whereas the shift in their eco-consciousness, it was something new to them. They didn't feel like they had a strong connection with nature prior to their psychedelic experience, and that the psychedelic experience had revealed this. They peeled back the layers of this deep interconnectedness that we have with our natural environment. And to give you a few quotes from that survey, people said things like, I'm connected to the same fabric of consciousness that pervades all of existence. And another one, this feeling separateness and alienation, this feeling of separateness and alienation was shattered by it, by the psychedelic experience. And I deeply understood that fundamentally there is no separation at all. So one of these classic kind of enhanced connection, enhanced eco-consciousness, mystical unity kind of transformations that we see. And we also went back and reviewed and inspected the notion of, well, which psychedelics do people volunteer as the substance which has changed their relationship with nature the most. You probably can't see that, but psilocybin was kind of mentioned by 80% of people as being a substance, one of the substances that had changed their relationship with nature. So, you know, fungus, magic mushrooms really are, in this context, our best opportunity of averting ecological crisis, I believe. And this kind of concurs with my previous research in looking into the literature. Wherever people talked about having kind of interspecies connections or enhanced nature experiences with psychedelics, more often than not, it was through the use of magic mushrooms. So much so that, in fact, one of the world's leading mycologists, Paul Stamets, is going to use one of his quotes he's put here. He said that psychedelic mushrooms proliferate in the wake of humans' habits of taming the land, such as chopping down trees, breaking ground to create roads and trails, and domesticating livestock. The messages we receive from them is always that we are part of an ecological, that time is short, and that we are part of a huge universal biosystem. And I don't think it's any particular accident that it's psilocybin either that seems to generate these experiences the most. And I think these are an excellent metaphor for this enhanced eco-connectedness. You know, the mycelium itself is the message, right? So mycelium, as we're discovering more and more about the fungal kingdom, have this kind of vast neural network, you know, with kind of billions of interconnections across different fungal mycelial networks, which also interconnect underneath forests, so that they become this kind of myco-internet for woods and forests, that they are engaged in this nutrient exchange between different trees, and they allow for a plant kinship. So they really are the connectors of the biological world as well. They're considered like the digestive tract of the forest. You know, they literally take all the death and dying matter and transform it and bring new life out of it. And in that way, they can also break down pollutants. And, Stamets point out how numerous ways in which fungus can be really key in literally, every area from ecology to medicine and so on and so forth. So the mycelium really is the message here, not least because we are in the biggest wave of mass extinction in 65 million years, and it is almost certainly all anthropogenic, created by humans. Right, so I'm going to move on, because I've eaten up a lot of time, but in terms of like the psychedelic research science, a lot of, we've seen a lot of resurgence of interest in these things from a neuroscientific perspective. There was a big surprise originally when the first it's my daughter. Guys, can you keep it down, please? Sorry about that. Living with a 4-year-old at a conference. Here we go. So it was a massive surprise when they started doing brain imaging studies with psilocybin and psychedelics, in that they were expecting to find like increases in brain activity in various regions of the brain. In fact, they only found decreases in activity in this default mode network hub region, which is essentially related to this kind of ego control center. And what happens is when you reduce the activity in this default mode network, it allows for this kind of unconstrained, super interconnected activity within the brain. So even though there's less activity, we find this massively enhanced amount of connectivity between different brain regions, which give rise to all kinds of wonderful experiences like synesthesia, most likely, but also enhanced creative problem solving and what we call divergent thinking. Luckily, I was involved in running a clinical drug trial with LSD, where we took about 50 top-level scientists, engineers, mathematicians, physicists from Imperial College, Cambridge, Oxford, and most of which had never taken psychedelics before in their life. We gave them LSD with a view to creatively problem-solving some of their kind of intractable research domain questions, so much so that, they all seemingly had breakthroughs, such as this kind of patented 3D model of a intelligent fabric, which I won't go into, but nonetheless to say that they had these creative problem-solving breakthroughs in their specific domains. Now, interestingly, the anthropologist Jeremy Narby, who was working with the Ashaninka tribe in South America, he came up with this rather wild hypothesis, which probably earned him a bit of ridicule from his kind of more scientifically orientated colleagues. And he said that there is such a proclivity for Amazonian shamans to see serpents in their visions in a kind of intertwined double helical way, that he suggested they were perhaps seeing the human DNA when they were having these experiences. I think my slides just crashed again. I'm going to carry on winging it without the slides for a minute. Just 1 second. I hate it when it does that. Right. So Narby had this kind of revelation because, often shamans from the Amazon, when they have these experiences, do see these double helix coils of serpents, and he said they're actually seeing human DNA, and often they report going and able to see inside bodies, see cells, see organs, and possibly even DNA. It seemed like a completely outlandish idea until you realize that actually this is not so uncommon even within biochemistry itself. So one of the Nobel Prize winning biochemists of recent years, Kary Mullis, received the Nobel Prize for biochemistry for his discovery of PCR, polymerase chain reaction, whereby you're able to take a single strand of DNA and replicate it. And he said he made his discovery by taking LSD and being able to zoom in at molecular level and see what was going on. Now, how is this possible? Is this the kind of super enhanced ability of his own imagination through his use of psychedelics, or, as Amazonian shamans would say, is this actually a kind of direct perception of transcendence of space and time? And it's a curious notion. We have lots of other examples of that. Some Francis Crick supposedly took LSD when he discovered the DNA double helix. Jeremy Narby took 3 molecular biologists into the Amazon. They gave them ayahuasca, and they had breakthroughs in their research. In the same, and one of them said she saw the DNA at a molecular level and could understand what was going on. And yet shamans themselves talk about seeing inside bodies, seeing organs and cells in a clairvoyant kind of way. Now it remains a kind of issue of discussion of whether or not this is some kind of transcendence of time and space, a clairvoyant psychic psi ability, or one of enhanced imagination. And the only way to really settle that argument is by doing controlled experiments, particularly with psychedelics, a number of which have been done over the years, mostly in the 60s and 70s. The forced choice designs, where they made people do card guessing tasks, were a bit of a disaster because they were exceedingly boring, and they went on for several hours with naive participants who had never taken psychedelics before. So they were somewhat disastrous. There were a number of free response kind of designs where people would just merely give their mentation of their experience with a particular distant target in mind. And those experiments on the whole were much more successful, but by today's scientific standards were very badly controlled. So the jury is still out on the psi-inducing nature of psychedelics. I will say, though, I've done my own experiments. I used a free response design. I initially started off with myself as a participant in an experiment of 20 trials of a kind of classic, kind of like Gansfield technique, but with mescaline instead of a Gansfield environment, using dynamic video clips as targets. I won't go into the details of that, other than to say it was successful. I got a significant result in a precognition type design on San Pedro relative to placebo. Of course, you can't have a real placebo with psychedelics because you always know when you're tripping, especially when you're the participant experimenter. So I tried to replicate this with my scientists under the influence of LSD. I had 13 participants who had experience of psychedelics. Take LSD, they did one trial of precognition task on a placebo in a blinded fashion, and once on LSD. And again, I got a significant result. But this time, unfortunately, it was in the opposite direction. I got a psi missing result from my top level scientists. And it is because their psi missing scores correlated with personality dimensions of neuroticism, introversion, and openness to experience. So that the more neurotic, introverted, and less open to experience they were, the more likely they were to psi miss the target. So I think this was an actual kind of based really on their personality rather than the task. I've since replicated it again with DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which occurs in ayahuasca. And I've used 20 participants. They either did a non-DMT or a DMT condition. And to give you an example, here's one of our hits from that experiment. The subject under the influence of DMT was able, in a precognition type task, describe a one of 4 random video clips that they were yet to see, which related to the target. They said they saw a 3D hexagon that I could see from the outside and also from the inside. Inside there were cells, organelles, and DMT strands, and this was the particular video clip. So much so that we got a significant result in that experiment, not without some caveats, but I'll maybe come back to that later. Now, I'm just going to wrap all this up. I'm going to jump past this. The research from positive psychology is also finding that psychedelics enhance all kinds of pro-social behavior, enhance openness to experience, value orientations, creative flexibility, empathy, self-transcendence. There really is very many positive dimensions that are coming out of this current research with psychedelics. So much so that myself and some colleagues have suggested that we could enhance the positive mental health dimensions of psychedelics if people were actually taking these in nature, because we already know that more time spent in nature is also a positive effect on mental health and well-being. So we're trying to move away from this medical hospital-based model of psilocybin psychotherapy. And just to kind of bring this all together, in kind of conclusion of the potential fusion between ecology and psychology where they intersect at the point of psychedelics, we can see that psychedelics enhance biophilia and eco-consciousness. They can change attitudes, they can change behaviors in more ecologically orientated directions. They enhance well-being. We've seen massive reductions in depression, anxiety, and addictions through the clinical use with giving people psychedelics in nature. And not only does it enhance well-being, but then as we increase people's biophilia or ecological self or eco-consciousness, it also will enhance the environment and help us of an ecological crisis. Not only that, I think there's a potential here for the use of psychedelics in exploring this kind of knife edge between enhanced creative problem solving and potential clairvoyance or psychic ability, and bringing in these kind of shamanic transformational processes, right? So to give you an example, Merlin Sheldrake was one of our participants in our LSD creative problem solving study. He had just finished his PhD on biology at Cambridge University at the time, and he was looking at his PhD problem, which was the nature of relationship between this a plant and a fungus, right? And he wasn't sure whether it was symbiotic or parasitic, because the plant basically took all its energy source directly from the fungus. And he took the LSD and he said he became the fungus. He grew inside the rootstock of the plant and was able to kind of experience it from a first-hand perspective. And we asked him, so, and he said, what was it like? And he said, slimy, you know, but he later dedicated the first chapter of his new book to relating that experience and saying how it gave him a lot of insight into the nature of this relationship. And he came to the conclusion it was actually symbiotic. So imagine if we could scale that up and give psychedelics in a held way to, you know, ecologists, architects, biologists, farmers, so on and so forth. Anybody who's engaged with ecology and the environment in a kind of creative problem-solving way. We could analogies to make them more harmonious and better for the environment. I think there's also a lot we can learn from the shamanic perspective and the original users of psychedelics over the years. We know that psychedelics seemingly increase people's interspecies communication. And this is something that shamans profess to kind of, you know, that's why they take psychedelics, and their perspective on nature as well. They see themselves as a part of nature, not apart from nature. And through a spirit of reciprocity, they maintain this harmony and balance. And these can really lead to a kind of reduction in this kind of species centricism that we have. On a more practical level, I think there's also room to explore some of the shamanic practices, the transcendence of time and space through psychedelics, the supposedly clairvoyant and precognitive abilities that they develop. And we need a lot more research on that. I've only begin to dive into it. It's still very nascent, but I think there's a lot there we can learn. Then their relationship to doctor plants, how they basically learn all of their medicine through taking psychedelics and meditating and eating nothing but a particular plant for a month at a time. And also their use of psychedelic shamanic work to manipulate local weather systems, which is something they often profess to do. I'm going to wrap up now. So I've been working, like I said, with the Huicholis for a few years. They're an extraordinary tribe. I won't go into the details, but on one of my encounters with them, basically there was a whole bunch of shamans. We just met up with them, and we were with our own shaman. There's another 5 shamans turned up, and they all got to talk. We were just about to introduce ourselves. They all got arguing straight away, and we were kind of just standing there trying to introduce ourselves, you know, like, oh, hi. And this enormous dust devil got up, you know, like 200 feet, 300 feet high, 30, 40 feet across, and it suddenly picked up all the dead maize leaves in the field and started coming towards us. They all had their back to it, so they didn't see it. And it wasn't until it was right upon us almost, like, I said to them, hey guys, like, look behind you. They turned around, they saw this enormous dust devil, and 2 of them just went, you know, one of them went like this, and the other went like that, and it seemingly just shoved the whole thing out of the way. And it carried on coming towards us, but then went round us in a big arc, and then carried on going behind us in a straight line. Now, one of the things they profess to do is manipulate local weather systems, make it rain on wheels. So I'm delighted to announce I've just received a grant from the PA, the Parapsychological Association, to do perhaps one of the first formal experiments exploring shamanic weather control. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.